It's an evening in late autumn. You are alone at home. The house is quiet, the particular quiet that only settles when no one is expecting anything from you, when the obligations of the day are done and there is no particular reason to be doing anything. You are not in a church, you are not in a seminar, you are not looking for anything. There is a Bible on the table in front of you. It has been there for a while. At some point in the last hour you opened it, not for any dramatic reason, just the way you sometimes do when something is nagging at you and you can't name what it is. You are in Mark, chapter 6, verse 3. Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joses and of Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? You have read this verse before. Many times probably. It has passed through your eyes without stopping, but tonight the names land differently. James, Joses, Judas, Simon. 4 names. Specific. The kind of specificity that belongs to people who were known, who showed up at synagogue, whose faces the community recognized. You read the second half of the sentence again, and are not his sisters here with us? Not one sister. Sisters. Plural. Unnamed. But plural, which means at least 2. The people of Nazareth listed them. They counted them. They named the brothers and indicated the sisters as a group that everyone in the room already knew. And the writer of Mark, the oldest gospel written within a generation of the crucifixion, saw no reason not to include them in the text. You sit with that. You think about every Sunday school class, every homily, every page of catechism. Nobody lingered here, nobody circled these names on the overhead projector. Nobody said, there is a family here. What happened to them? Tonight you notice the sentence that was always there. My name is Nathan, former high school history teacher, Evansville, Indiana. 12 years at a Catholic school teaching world history and early Christianity. I resigned when the evidence kept leading me somewhere the institution was not prepared to follow. I want to talk about those names, not as a curiosity, not as a minor textual detail that scholars debate in footnotes, as evidence. Because the brothers and sisters of Jesus, what the text actually says about them, what the Greek actually means, and when the church decided those words meant something else, is one of the most precise case studies available in how a doctrine gets built. Not through suppression of hidden texts, not through councils destroying evidence. Through a single man, in the year 383 CE, inventing a new meaning for a word that had meant something else for 400 years. Here is where I need to start. Mark 6.3 uses the Greek word adelphos for brother, 4 times. James, Joses, Judas, Simon. 4 brothers, each one adelphos. The passage about sisters uses the related form indicating the same relational category. In Hellenistic Greek, the Greek of the New Testament, the Greek of the Mediterranean world in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, adelphos meant brother, full biological brother or half-brother at closest extension. It was a precise kinship term, not a general term of closeness, not metaphorical address among religious community members in this context, a specific word for a specific relationship. And here is the detail that took me years to fully absorb. The New Testament has another Greek word, anepsios. It means cousin or nephew. It is a different word used for a different relationship. Anepsios appears in the New Testament. In Colossians 4:10, Paul uses it to describe Mark as Barnabas's cousin. The word existed. The New Testament authors knew it. They used it correctly when they needed it. They never used it for Jesus' siblings. Not once. Every time the New Testament refers to Jesus' brothers, Mark 6:3, Matthew 13:55, Acts 1:14, 1 Corinthians 9:5, Galatians 1:19, the word is adelphos. The word for cousin was available. The word for cousin was not used. But here is the piece of evidence that stops me every time I return to it. Galatians 1:19. Paul writes, in Greek, in a letter most scholars date to approximately 48 to 55 CE, the following sentence. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother, adelphos tou Kyriou, brother of the Lord. Paul was writing within 20 years of the crucifixion. The synoptic gospels had not yet been composed. The perpetual virginity doctrine was 3 centuries in the future. Paul had been to Jerusalem. He had stayed with Peter for 15 days. He had met James personally, sat with him, ate with him, had a conversation, and in the letter where Paul used anepsios correctly to describe a cousin relationship in a different context, Colossians 4:10, the same corpus, the same man, the same Greek. He chose adelphos for James. Paul knew the difference. He knew both words. He used the right one. I've never found a way around that. I've never found a scholar in the Catholic tradition, the Protestant tradition, the secular tradition, who explains why a man writing in Greek in the 50s CE, who knew the word for cousin and used it correctly elsewhere, chose the word for brother when referring to James unless he meant the word for brother. That is not a later interpolation. That is not a council decision. That is Paul 20 years after the events describing a living person he had personally met. Now let me show you Luke, because the Galatians evidence is the most direct, personal witness, earliest chronology, clearest Greek. But there is a second piece of textual evidence that operates differently. Luke 2:7 refers to Jesus as Mary's prototokos, her firstborn. The Greek word prototokos is precise. It means the first child born of a woman, not only, not singular, first. The word implies, grammatically, that there will be others. It is the word used for the first in a sequence, the way firstborn works in English. You don't call someone your firstborn unless they are followed by more children, or at least followed by the expectation of more. If the author of Luke believed or intended his readers to understand that Jesus was Mary's only child, permanently by theological necessity, he would not have used prototokos. He would have used monogenes, only child, only born. The word used in John 3:16 for Jesus' relationship to God the Father, a different Greek word, available, used elsewhere by New Testament authors for exactly this concept. Luke used prototokos. In the year Luke was writing, there was no perpetual virginity doctrine to maintain. He had no defense to construct. He used the word that fit the family he was describing. Before 383 CE, the dominant reading of these passages in the Christian tradition was the natural one. Tertullian, writing in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, one of the most prolific and influential early Christian writers, accepted that Jesus had natural brothers and sisters, children of Joseph and Mary, born after Jesus. He did not treat this as controversial. He treated it as what the text said. Origen, writing in the early 3rd century, was the first Christian theologian I can find who proposed that the brothers of Jesus might be sons of Joseph from a previous marriage, a defense of Mary's perpetual virginity. But even he acknowledged he was working against the most natural reading of the text. He was arguing for an alternative. He knew what the Greek said. Helvidius, a theologian writing in Rome in the 380s, published a treatise arguing for the natural reading. The brothers of Jesus, he argued, were exactly what the Greek said they were, the natural children of Joseph and Mary, born after Jesus. His argument was textually straightforward. Adelphos means brother. Paul used anepsios for cousin and did not use it here. Luke used prototokos, not monogenes. Helvidius was not inventing a fringe position. He was defending what the majority of Christian writers before him had accepted as the plain meaning of the text. But here is where the trail deepens. In 383 CE, a scholar named Jerome, the most accomplished Latin translator of his era, the man who would produce the Vulgate, the Church's authorized Latin Bible, wrote a treatise in response to Helvidius. The treatise is called Adversus Helvidium, against Helvidius, on the perpetual virginity of Mary, and in it, Jerome invented what scholars now call the cousin theory. His argument was this, that in the New Testament, adelphos sometimes derives from a Hebrew or Aramaic concept of brotherhood that is broader than the Greek kinship term. That in the Jewish tradition, the word for brother could encompass close relatives, including cousins. That the brothers of Jesus were not biological brothers, but close family relations, cousins most likely. I want to be precise about the problem with this argument. The Gospels were not written in Hebrew. They were not written in Aramaic. They were written in Greek, the Koine Greek of the Hellenistic Mediterranean world, a Greek with precise kinship vocabulary, a Greek in which adelphos and anepsios were not interchangeable. Jerome was one of the finest Greek scholars of the ancient world. He knew this. And then he did something that I have thought about for a long time. He translated Mark 6:3 into Latin for the Vulgate. He chose the Latin word frater. Frater means brother. He translated adelphos as brother, because that is what the word meant in the Greek, and he knew it. Then he wrote an entire treatise explaining why the Greek behind his own translation did not mean what his translation said. Jerome's Vulgate, the most widely used Christian Bible for 1,000 years, translates these brothers as brothers. Jerome's treatise, written the same year he was working on the Vulgate, explains why they were not. I need you to hold that for a moment. The Church's oldest authorized Latin Bible is more honest about this passage than all the theology built on top of it. Jerome did not invent the cousin theory without context. He was not working in an intellectual vacuum, driven purely by theological conviction. He was writing in Rome. He had powerful patrons, specifically wealthy Roman women of the senatorial class, who had taken vows of celibacy and whose religious identities were built around the ascetic veneration of perpetual virginity as the highest spiritual state. Paula, Marcella, Eustochium. These were his circle, his patronesses, the women who provided the material support for his scholarship and his translation work. The theological pressure was not abstract. It had faces, it had names, it had money attached to it. Jerome was not the first to argue for perpetual virginity, and he was not the last. But the cousin theory, the specific mechanism that reinterpreted adelphos in Mark and Matthew and Galatians, that was his invention. It appeared in 383 CE. For 300 years before that, Christian writers had either accepted the natural reading or proposed a different defense. Which brings me to the second defense, because there were two of them, running at the same time, contradicting each other, both invented to explain away the same 6 uses of adelphos. Epiphanius of Salamis was a contemporary of Jerome's. He also defended the perpetual virginity of Mary, but he did not use the cousin theory. He used what scholars call the Epiphanian defense. The brothers of Jesus were not cousins. They were not born of Mary at all. They were Joseph's sons from a previous marriage, a prior wife, unnamed in any canonical text, who had died before Joseph's betrothal to Mary. Epiphanius was specific. He named the brothers, James, Joseph, Judas, Simon. He named the sisters, Mary and Salome. He named them. He was defending the proposition that Mary had no children other than Jesus, and in doing so, he named the people that proposition required him to explain. He gave them names and placed them in the family history of Jesus. The sisters are named in the Epiphanian tradition because Epiphanius named them while building his case that they weren't Mary's. I want to pause on what this means. In 383 CE, the two primary defenses of perpetual virginity were Jerome. The brothers are cousins, not brothers at all. Adelphos means something different here than it means everywhere else. Epiphanius. The brothers are Joseph's sons from a previous marriage. They are half-brothers of Jesus through Joseph, unrelated to Mary. These are not compatible positions. Either the brothers are cousins who aren't really brothers at all, or they are Joseph's children from a prior wife who aren't Mary's children. You cannot hold both positions simultaneously. Two scholars writing at the same time, defending the same doctrine, contradicting each other completely on how to defend it, and both inventing new explanations for the same Greek text, which had been in circulation for 300 years without either explanation being necessary. The text didn't change in 383 CE, the doctrine needed defending in 383 CE, and the two best Greek scholars of the era gave it two incompatible defenses. This is where the scholarly reckoning becomes important, because I am not presenting this as the opinion of skeptics or critics of the Church. I want to tell you what the most careful Catholic New Testament scholarship of the 20th century concluded. John P. Meier was a Catholic priest, a professor at Notre Dame, and the author of A Marginal Jew, Rethinking the Historical Jesus, a multi-volume scholarly work, peer-reviewed, published by Doubleday, that applied every available tool of historical critical scholarship to the New Testament evidence. Volume 1, published in 1991, devotes 335 pages to questions of Jesus' origins and family. Meier's conclusion on the brothers and sisters, The most probable interpretation, by every standard of Greek philological analysis, is that the brothers and sisters of Jesus were the natural children of Joseph and Mary, born after Jesus. He does not accept the cousin theory. He analyzes Jerome's argument and finds it linguistically untenable. When adelphos is used in the New Testament for family relationships, it means full brother or half-brother, never stepbrother, never cousin, never the broader Semitic category Jerome invented. He does not accept the Epiphanian defense. There is no textual, historical, or archaeological evidence for a prior wife of Joseph. The figure is invented. Meier dismisses it. His conclusion is the natural reading of the Greek. John P. Meier is a Catholic priest. He wrote this under academic peer review for a Catholic university press with full knowledge of what it meant. I discovered Meier after about 3 years of pulling this thread. I found the first volume at a used bookstore in Bloomington. I was driving back from a conference, stopped in, didn't mean to spend more than 10 minutes. The book was sitting with its spine facing out on a cart near the door. I bought it mostly because of the title. By the time I was 200 pages in, I had already started writing the notes that eventually became the framework for everything I investigate now. But it was a conversation with my thesis advisor that crystallized something I had not quite seen. He was a Jesuit, one of the finest Greek scholars I have ever encountered, the kind of man who read Hellenistic texts the way I read the newspaper, effortlessly in the original. I brought him the question after reading Meier for the first time. He listened. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he stood up, went to the shelf behind his desk, the one I was never allowed to pull from without asking, and slid 2 things across the table toward me. Jerome's Adversus Helvidium, a scholarly edition, heavily annotated, and his own copy of Meier's Volume 1. He sat back down and said, "Jerome invented this in 383. He was right about almost everything else in his career. He was one of the great Greek scholars of the patristic era. He knew what adelphos meant. He translated it, frater, brother, in the Vulgate, because that's what the Greek said." He looked up over his glasses. "I have taught this passage for 30 years. I have never introduced what it's doing by name. I didn't understand what that meant for another decade. Now I do. You are sitting with the Bible open to Mark 6. The names are still there: James, Joseph, Judas, Simon. And then the sisters, plural, unnamed, present in the synagogue, known to the community. Now I want you to think about the sisters specifically. The Epiphanian tradition named them Mary and Salome, 2 women who grew up in Nazareth, who attended the synagogue, who are present in the crowd the day the community reacts to their brother's teaching. Named in an ancient Christian text by a theologian who was working to explain them away. He named them while building the case that they didn't count. The Greek text of Mark says sisters, plural. The community recognized them. The Epiphanian tradition preserved their names, not in devotion, not in veneration, but as evidence in an argument. In 2,000 years, neither Mary nor Salome has appeared in a church calendar. The brothers at least have a historical residue. James of Jerusalem was executed by the Sanhedrin in 62 CE, documented by Josephus, one of the few New Testament-adjacent figures confirmed in Jewish historical sources outside the Christian tradition. He was significant enough that his death required documentation in the Jewish antiquities. The sisters have nothing. They were named in the ancient tradition by the very theologian arguing that they weren't who the text said they were, and then they were made invisible twice, once by the doctrine that redefined their relationship to Jesus, and again by the centuries that followed, which never found room for them in the calendar of holy memory. They were there. The text says so. The tradition named them. The doctrine made them invisible. This is where J.J. Benitez becomes essential to the full picture. 40 years of research, 15 trips to the Middle East, sustained investigation across archives in multiple languages, fieldwork across the region, sustained engagement with the documentary and archaeological evidence. In the Caballo de Troya series, Benitez does not describe Jesus as an only child. He does not sidestep the family question. He does something that took me time to fully understand the significance of. He describes Jesus's family as a real family. Natural biological children of Joseph and Mary. James, Joseph, Simon, Judas, brothers, sisters, a household in Nazareth with the ordinary dynamics of a large first-century Jewish family, sibling relationships, birth order. The texture of domestic life in a household where a father works in construction and a mother manages a home, and the children grow up alongside the eldest and don't always understand him. Benitez places Jesus inside a family that the church spent 300 years denying existed, and the profile he describes, the family structure, the household dynamics, the social position of the brothers after the crucifixion, coheres with everything the documentary evidence provides. I cannot verify Benitez's methodology the way I can verify Meier or Ehrman. He is not writing academic history, but I can tell you that what he describes is consistent with every piece of evidence from the region and the period. The Greek of the New Testament, the early Christian writers, the Josephus reference to James, the Pauline letters. What the full human family means for the doctrines built on its denial is not a minor question. Perpetual virginity was not an isolated belief. It was the foundation for a theology of the body, a hierarchy of spiritual states, placing celibacy above marriage, a framework that shaped how the church thought about women, sexuality, and the material world for 17 centuries. The family in Nazareth, if it existed as the Greek says, as Paul confirms, as Meier concludes, is not a footnote to the Jesus story. It is a structural challenge to the edifice built in 383. Here is what happened after 62 CE. James, the brother of the Lord, was the leader of the Jerusalem church from the crucifixion until his execution by the Sanhedrin. He was, in scholarly consensus, the most important figure in early Christianity who is not Paul, a central authority, recognized across the nascent movement, the man to whom Peter deferred when they disagreed at Antioch. Paul describes going to Jerusalem specifically to meet him. Josephus records his death. In 62 CE, the high priest Ananus had James stoned. Josephus calls it an injustice. The Jerusalem community was grieved by it. 8 years later, in 70 CE, Rome destroyed Jerusalem. The temple fell. The Jerusalem church, the community James had led, the community rooted in the family of Jesus, the community that had known Jesus personally, that included people who had grown up with him, was scattered, destroyed. The Gentile church survived. Rome, Antioch, Alexandria. The communities that had not known Jesus in person, that did not have family members of Jesus in their leadership, that were building their theology of him from texts and traditions rather than from direct memory. The surviving church had no institutional reason to maintain the priority of Jesus' family. James was dead. His community was destroyed. The people who had known the brothers, who had known the sisters, were gone. The Gentile tradition that rebuilt Christianity after 70 CE inherited the texts. They inherited the Greek. They inherited Galatians 1:19 and Mark 6:3, but they did not inherit the people those texts described. The perpetual virginity doctrine was formally confirmed at the Lateran Council of 649 CE. Mark wrote those names down approximately 600 years earlier. James, Joseph, Simon, Judas, unnamed sisters, plural, in the oldest gospel, in Greek, using the word that means brother. For 600 years the text sat there. Then a council made the doctrine binding. I want to close with two objects that are sitting on my desk right now. Jerome's Adversus Helvidium, 383 CE, a scholarly edition, annotated, the treatise that invented the cousin theory. The argument that adelphos, in 6 specific uses out of hundreds across the New Testament, means something other than brother. And John P. Meier's A Marginal Jew, Volume 1. Dog-eared worn. 335 pages of the most rigorous Catholic New Testament scholarship of the 20th century, concluding that the most probable interpretation of those 6 uses of adelphos is natural children of Mary and Joseph. 2 books, 1600 years apart, one inventing the exception, one dismantling it. And the man who wrote the first one, Jerome, finest Greek scholar of his era, translator of the Bible, chose frater when he put the Greek into Latin. Brother. because that is what the Greek said. And then he wrote the treatise explaining why the Greek behind his own translation didn't mean what his translation said. I want to sit with that for a moment, not with anger, not with the need to damage anyone's faith, with the recognition of what it means when a man of that caliber, a man who knew exactly what the words meant, is placed in a position where what the words mean and what the doctrine needs are two different things. He chose the doctrine. He built the argument. He knew it was an argument, not a translation. His own translation is the proof. The names have been in the text for 2,000 years. James, Joses, Simon, Judas. Two sisters, unnamed, who attended the synagogue in Nazareth and were known to the community by face. The family that showed up at some point in Jesus' ministry because they thought he had lost his mind. Mark 3:21 records it, without flinching. His family came to take charge of him because they thought he was out of his mind. They were wrong about what he was doing. But they were there. They showed up. They tried to bring him home. That is not the family of a man who was an only child. And the church eventually decided it was easier to change the meaning of a word than to let them stand there in the text. The word did not change. The doctrine tried to. This is Nathan. Forbidden Gospels. I'll let you sit with that.